Good afternoon. Same course as before. This is really the second in a series of lectures about regimes or points of view which I want to describe as affirmatively anti-human rights rather than simply ignoring human rights. And I'll try to explain why and how that's the case today. So let me just preface this lecture by saying that we're going to talk about another kind of another radical anti-humanitarian, anti-human rights regime next time when we talk about the Nazis. And we're also going to consider the difficulties other political philosophies have with the concept of human rights as discussed in the Stephen Luke article that you're reading. But today I want to concentrate on just one part of that. I want to talk about the Soviet story. Now, it's not an easy lecture for me to give, though for you it's just like any other lecture. And the reason is this whole story I'm about to tell you was so much caught up in the politics and discussions of the Cold War of my youth, that speaking about this book and speaking about the anti-human rights of the agenda, it is really an agenda, of the Stalinist regime is in a way taking one back to the sort of debates which many of you, I suspect, didn't even notice in the movie last night. So, for example, the Soviet prosecutors, you might recall, accuses the Germans of war crimes, which is to say killing the Polish officer class and intellectuals. So that was an important, one of the four charges in these war crimes, and it seemed important to make this against the Nazis. It was known by insiders at the time that in fact the Germans didn't do this, the Russians did it. I'll talk about this a little bit today. And in 1990 we finally have the documents that prove that the Russians did it. I mean, we've had huge amounts of evidence before, we now have the internal documents. When we talked about this subject in the 60s and 70s though, if one spoke about the fact that the Russians did it, one said, well maybe so, but we need to punish the Germans, and fascism was worse, and the Nazis were worse. And there was a lot of right-wing discussion in Germany, some ultra-right-wing discussion saying, well, yes, the Nazis had some excesses, but basically they were on the right track because they were opposed to this really horrible ideology of communism. So one felt and somehow compelled to defend the communist regime in Russia, or to deny that some of these things happened, or to not see it as clearly as one might see it, because of those people who were pushing it, and of their alliance with fascist regimes who were, one doesn't want to compare particularly, but who were also really bad. So the context of this then in my growing up, and also the context of this in the 30s, is very much a radical anti-communism which seemed to favor the rise of a fascist regime. So in the 1930s, many people in the center and right basically said, look, better Hitler than Stalin. So Kessler and Gorbachev and many people said, well, no, maybe not. At least in principle, the idea of a classless society and of anti-racism is actually better than, in principle, the idea of a community based on race. So now we are mercifully, I think, out of this, or at least these are historical discussions. We're after the Cold War, and we can start to just talk about these issues as history. So this is actually the first time I'm lecturing on this subject as a historical subject, rather than as a part of the debate about the 1930s and the 1950s and the 1960s. So let's begin with this, and begin with the question of why do I, and I follow Stephen Luke's here and others, regard the communist regime, especially the communist regime as it became defined by orthodoxy, the Leninist Stalin orthodoxy in Russia, in proletariat, that's his phrase, as in principle not hospitable to human rights. Well, the reason is, I'll give you several reasons, are that if one believes, and as the doctrine held, that there will come a time when there is no more conflict amongst humans. And I'll explain to you why in a moment why this is. If we come to such a time, there is no need for human rights. That is to say, the human rights regime is an anachronism. Because the human rights regime grows out of a world in which there actually is antagonism between groups. So as Marx said, and Luke quotes him on this, the definitive resolution of the antagonism between man and nature and between man and man is what will come with the revolution. It's the true solution of the conflict between existence and essence, between what we really are and how we live, between objectification and self-affirmation, between freedom and necessity, between individual and species. It's the solution of the riddle to history and knows itself to be the solution. In other words, if one believes in this sort of end of history, if one believes in this end of history, and one believes that all the sort of divisions that now exist amongst humans and within each of us between different identifications will disappear, then one hasn't a need for human rights. Now, in the meantime, human rights and the notion of human rights and of sentiment and of humanitarianism only softens the heart wrongly, when in fact all morality lies in this united discipline and consciousness of mass struggles against the exploits, certainly without the exploits against exploitation. I might find this, but exploitation will fix that. So, this is a theme you get again and again in this book. His feeling that whenever Gorbachev's feeling, that whenever he becomes soft, whenever he lets what we call humanitarianism, the feeling for an individual person, the feeling for someone else's suffering, the feeling morality should be based on this to overwhelm him, he understands that he's leaving aside, he's turning aside from the truth, which is that it doesn't actually matter, because what you really want to do is move history forward. So Marx himself and many of the were aggressively against, not just ignored, but actually against the kind of humanitarianism we're talking about. It was ameliorationist was the term. Marx supported some ameliorationist positions, for example, the vote, because he thought it was a means of overthrowing the system. Now, I want to just point out to you that not all people on the left, and certainly not even all people who call themselves Marxists, believe this. And one of the great splits in the European left from the 19th century on was the view that, in fact, a step-by-step process was possible, that one could ameliorate social conditions, one could even resolve the social question, one could transfer the means of production to the working class eventually without the means that were being proposed by others. And so, in fact, it was a great debate in the 19th century, and it was a great debate in the 20th century, where many people on the European and to some extent the American left argued, look, the Soviet Union is not communism. Not everyone has to believe in what the Gorbachevs, and we'll say them, Bukharin, the person who he's modeled, believed. But I'm giving you now the version of Marx, which was taken up by the Stalinist, Leninist version, and which became essentially the core of the Soviets' version on this subject. So this lecture is really about how a particular set of ideas played themselves out in a particular rather large place in the world. I do think that it didn't just happen to play themselves out. I think this view of a cosmic history which overrides the individual is a terribly dangerous view. But I do want to point out that there were people at the time who understood this as a distant possibility, but also understood that day by day, we don't need to give up sentiment and humanitarianism. And I'll come to this in just a moment in the last quote. Okay, so in the meantime then, while we're waiting for this, the end, the final denouement, we mustn't soften our hearts. And as Engels writes here, eventually, a real human morality which transcends class antagonism, and their legacies of thought becomes possible only at a stage of society which has not only overcome class contradictions, but has even forgotten them in practical life. This is from a very important Leninist tractable Engels called the Anti-Dühring. Dühring was a German social democratic academic and politician who argued just this, what I just argued you earlier, that a kind of more humanitarian, more gradualist, more reformist road to socialism was possible. That branch of the socialist project was actually kicked out of an international movement in the 1920s. But when Engels wrote, and particularly in the 1890s and 1910s, this was really an important part of the world socialist movement. And the biggest socialist party, the German Socialist Party, against which Hitler fought, was a reformist party. They said, yes, eventually this will happen, but we don't need to do the Gorbachev route. Okay. That's the historical, ideological context. So I think that Luce is right. I think that many people tried to get around that through a revisionist program, but what became Marxist orthodoxy didn't, and followed through on these broader philosophical claims that Marx made in a very singular way. Okay, so what Engels is saying basically only in a class of society is morality possible, and if that's the case, one doesn't need human rights. And meanwhile, as you see in the novel, and as Gorbachev writes in his diary, this is on page 99, history had taught us that lies serve better than truth. And all sorts of things serve better than truth. That's one of the core moves of the novel. Okay, that's the specific ideological context. Let's look at moving history along its path, which, as you know from reading the novel, is the kind of central trope of this novel. The character is involved in moving history along and disregarding all those things which are or should be swept aside in history. Well, the background to this story are the two great revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th century. The one is the French Revolution that I've already alluded to you, which gave rise to the document which you guys read and studied, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the Declaration of the Rights of Women. It swept aside, declared to have swept aside in one day this very old feudal regime, which is feudal relations, and put in a liberal regime. And the next century and a half of European world political history is about producing that kind of new liberal regime in the absence of an absolutist monarch. So we have the French Revolution replayed in the early stages, Russian Revolution in 1905 and in March 1917. We have it replayed in China in 1911. It becomes understood in the minds of political people as that phase which ends feudalism and it sets the stage for the kind of liberal project that you read about in your document. The second revolution is the Industrial Revolution. That also figures very largely in the novel that you're reading. What was the Industrial Revolution? Well, in a relatively slow way, we now know, sometime between around 1750 and 1850, England and parts of Scotland became an industrial society. That means to say that the majority of people lived in cities. Not the majority of production, but a great deal of production happened in factories and in larger workshops rather than artisanally at home. And by 1870, England being the leader of this, something like only 20% of the population are living in the countryside. So a tiny number of people are supplying food for this much more rapid, dynamic